Here's a previous video that was aired on my channel a few years ago featuring 1965 and 66 Pontiacs with guest Marc. This time, though, I'm reposting it in HD as I have some edited software now so you can see it in full high definition. Hope you enjoy. Okay, well, welcome back to Rare Classic Cars. We have Marc yet again.
I'm back by unpopular demand?
Unpopular, yeah.
Okay,
Usually the videos where you talk about cars, nobody really likes them, but I felt sorry for you.
Okay, so this is why you called me earlier today and said, you know, I should come over here. Because
no, that was just a robocall.
Right. No banter.
So welcome again. Marc is here, and we're going to talk about the epitome of Coke bottle design here, two mid-60s Pontiacs.
This time both cars are yours. And my quick disclaimer at the beginning of the video, because I currently work at General Motors as a designer, and I am disclosing this to all the viewers so that there is no misunderstandings, even though I've worked at a bunch of car companies, but I've been actually at General Motors for quite some time, and talking about these wonderful, beautiful cars here is actually something that's a lot of fun for me to do. So thank you for the invitation to join you in a video again.
Well, thank you, Marc. Well, let's walk around each. We can talk a little bit about each. We'll go from there.
Well, I mean, they're your cars, so why don't you introduce?
So this is a 65 Bonneville. This is finished in maroon here, or actually it's called burgundy. And this one is finished in Marina turquoise, which each of these colors was used on various GM vehicles, but that was
I think the Marina turquoise was also the tropic turquoise, right? The tropical.
It was on
Oldsmobiles.
It was tropic turquoise.
Yeah.
And I think it was just plain turquoise on Buick. They had a number of names for it. But
it's not even turquoise. It's green, but never mind.
You're the designer.
We're going to start the discussion again.
All right.
We have a friend who is very insistent that this is turquoise, and I say it's green.
Well, let's start the discussion.
Well, the discussion, there's so much to discuss here, but I have to say, Adam, you certainly have two of the nicest examples here that I've ever seen of this mid-60s, I would say, peak Coke bottle Pontiacs, because this was a really significant series of cars in the sense that GM at the time was always at the forefront of certain styling trends. They were at their peak of their market share. They had peaked before in the mid-50s, I believe, and then it dropped off a little bit. And then by the mid-60s, GM was just on a roll with their vehicles under Bill Mitchell, the legendary Bill Mitchell, the second vice president of styling at the time of design. And Bill Mitchell, of course, succeeded the famous or infamous Harley Earl, who was at the helm of GM Art and Color and then styling later on for 30 years.
That's right.
And Mitchell succeeded him, and there's one thing, Mitchell is a very, very colorful and very mercurial and very interesting character who has a lot of things said about him and a lot of fascinating anecdotes about him. But one thing that everybody agrees on is GM made no ugly cars under Bill Mitchell.
All right, so let's get into it, Marc. And you had mentioned in the introduction something about peak Coke bottle design.
Yeah.
So what does that refer to?
Well, obviously, these cars have a beautiful, very pronounced wave or hip shape here under the C-pillar, which if you go and look at the whole side view, the proportion of it reminded a lot of people of a Coke bottle that's laying on its side, right? So this is where the terminology came from. GM's first car to really play up this design motif was the 1963 Riviera, which was a car that was one of Bill Mitchell's favorites in terms of his influence over the gestation process and how it was developed. He had seen some coach-built British cars, like big, large limousines in London that had a certain way of creating a sheer surfacing look and the way the windows were set in, and they also had the bodywork creating a certain type of surface character that he wanted expressed in the Riviera. And so the Riviera mixed a few of those influences with some very sporting, very elegant cues from some performance cars. If you recall, let's say the C1 Corvettes, the original Corvettes, the BMW 507 Roadster, and many of those classic Roadster cars, they have a hip shape because in order to get the big wheelhouse under the body structure and to have a low belt line, oftentimes these cars had a dip down in the side and then they kind of humped back up over the rear wheels. And that was a typical a mark of some performance cars that were very small, where the wheel packaging kind of drove the body shape volumes, and it became a bit of a cue for sportiness and for exclusivity. So Mitchell applied that to the '63 Riviera in force, and that was the first car to really express that Coke bottle shape on the body side line. And that caught on so successfully that it was applied across the board. Except Cadillac, every GM division had a Coke bottle shape in one form or another in the mid-'60s. So peak Coke bottle is around 65, 66, 67.
And it quickly disappeared.
And then it quickly disappeared because they were on to another thing. That's the nature of the fashion nature of the car styling, of the design aspect, especially in a market that is so styling driven like the American market was. So styling driven like the American market in those days. And but it was so impactful that it went global. I mean, the Coke bottle went global. Ford was kind of late in adapting it. They had a bunch of vehicles in the early '70s that still did it. If you look at the mid-size cars, the Montegos and the Torinos, and those cars had a very strong hippie kind of Coke bottle reference in their shapes. And then also the European Ford Cortina Taunus, the Cortina Taunus TC in the early '70s in Europe, that was a very, very pronounced Coke bottle shape. GM Europe, of course, this coming from North America, but GM Europe, Opel, Vauxhall had a lot of very strong Coke bottle shaped cars. And then GM abandoned it by the late '60s, early '70s. It was all but gone, and pretty much gone by time 1971 rolled around. And 72.
71 Pontiacs in the '70s look a lot different than this, too.
They do. The full-size cars, at least, they're still echoed a little bit in the mid-size cars. It lingered a little bit, but by '73 was basically gone. Except some of the Colonnade cars in '73 had sort of big sweeping fender shapes,
like the Regal.
The Regal, for instance,
Yeah.
had, and there were some other cliches, but they weren't really Coke bottle, because Coke bottle also means that it's not just a crease line in the body side, the window line comes with it. So it's really pronounced, and you can really tell from a very, very far distance. There's a lot of cars that have flowing, hipped lines on the body side, creases, but they don't necessarily take the window graphic with it. And that's one of the main hallmarks of the Coke bottle shape, is the entire roof line, the belt line, everything flows along this sort of wave shape on the body side.
So you have that first theme, the Coke bottle design. Then you also have kind of this fastback coupe design,
that was
right?
another cliche that was very popular by the time the mid-'60s, late '60s rolled around. Was all of a sudden the two-door coupes became almost two-volume cars instead of three-box cars. A coupe was traditionally also a three-box car, meaning three boxes. One is the engine compartment, then the cabin, and then the trunk. And they became almost a two-volume car, a two-box car, by having a very, very fast rear pillar and backlight and flowing very gracefully into the trunk. And that, of course, peaked at about 1967-68. The subsequent Grand Prix and the full-size cars as well had very, very drastic fastbacks. So did the mid-size cars. It was a very popular styling motif until it gave way to the more formal executions in the '70s, when the big Brougham age and the very, very pseudo-luxurious cliches came in. Then the fastback sort of disappeared.
That was another thing that Cadillac didn't copy. They had very formal roof lines in this
Correct.
time
So
period as well.
because Cadillac taking a different position in the corporate lineup, being more dignified, having to have more sort of conservative prestige, not so advanced, the very sporty, very flowing, very sexy shapes of the Coke bottle design weren't deemed appropriate for Cadillac. So Cadillac stayed with a much more conservative approach and a much more formal approach.
Interesting. And then this also has the stacked headlight theme that came to
That was
Pontiac,
one
right?
thing that Pontiac became one of the main proponents of. Cadillac, of course, also having stacked headlamps in the mid-1960s. But it's an interesting detail that comes out in the '66 versus the '65. The treatment of the front end on the '66 is in a way much cleaner and much more unified than it was originally on the '65s. And Pontiac followed a formula. They were doing this on the Grand Prix as well, just with a 1 year ahead.
63 Grand Prix.
63 and '64 Grand Prix, just with a 1 year time delay. They were a year ahead of the full-size cars. So they started out on the front end treatment started out with a very sculptural and very complex looking assembly with very strong emphasis on the individual chrome bezels for the headlamps, and we don't only have a vertical stagger, we also have a fore-aft stagger because the upper headlamp is a little bit ahead of the lower, so it gives you a little bit of a forward-leaning character that's supposed to emphasize all these, these Z shapes that are leaning forward and giving the whole thing kind of a hunched forward posture, a little bit of dynamic motion in the character of the lines.
You kind of get that too, even with the hood, the front of the hood. It's
right. Everything there's nothing really straight on these cars. There's nothing really up down in a vertical fashion. Everything has slight angle and lean to give it the character of motion and sort of a car that's ready for speed. And then everything has little details like the stagger fore aft of the headlamp pods, the highly detailed headlamp pods or bezels with these ridges here, the emphasis on the chrome surrounds, and then you go to the 66 and you have a much more unified and almost formal approach, because now you simply have stacked headlights that are no longer staggered fore aft. You have a body color molding that is the bezel around it, so you de-emphasize the complexity. And it gives it a very different character, and it gives a very strong differentiation between what is essentially identical bodies, because the main panel stampings were identical between 65 and 66. So this was a classic facelift, but a facelift with details done in a way to give it a very different character. And that's something they also did on the 63 to 64 Pontiac Grand Prix. If you compare the front end treatment especially, but also some of the rear end details, it follows a similar philosophy. It starts with a very complex, very chrome accent driven design, and then it becomes a more integrated design that has more of the body color surround, so the details don't show up as drastically.
And this changed so significantly between 66 and 7, and they had a much different
very different philosophy there. 67 was sort of the peak concealed headlight era, so concealed headlamps became very popular. It's another one of those design motifs that were trendy and very fashionable, and of course they were complex, and they had quality and alignment issues, and they had reliability issues ultimately after a long use time. And so they went away again in the early 70s because of all these reasons, but they were around for a while because it was a trendy thing to do. And again, a totally different philosophy there, very much integrated. We're seeing the loop bumper themes lurking that came in the late 1960s, was a very popular theme then, where it was even cleaner and even more integrated than this design, which is already a very clean and dramatic presentation of shapes. Another interesting thing for the Pontiacs is, of course, that this is a very specific way of how they handled the stacking or doubling up of elements and shapes. This is something that's very typical of Pontiac of the era, where you have identical shapes that are doubled up and stacked and organized in a way to give you authority and presence on the road, making it look very authoritative and very important, but also at the same time adding visual interest. And then towards the late 1960s, and also when other brands tried similar approaches, you have a move away from this complexity, and you go to the loop bumpers, like if you think of the 69 Chevrolets, the full-size Chevys, the Chryslers. You get the opposite, where you get a simplification of all the elements, and ultimately the reduction to just one major element, which is the loop or the oval for the bumper. So within a few years you have a complete 180 when it comes to the approach of how to define front end signatures.
Even Chevrolet tried that in the 2000s. Remember the Malibu and that graphic, the double
up and well, that was a traditional Chevrolet or a branded cue from the early 70s, where Chevrolet had these grills that were bisected by the bumper.
That's right.
And so you had an upper and a lower grill, and and the big grill bar in the middle of some of the Chevy truck front ends. That's a reference to this classic dissected Chevy bumper or front end theme that's been around basically for half a century.
I have to say too, these cars, now a lot of vehicles don't have overly distinctive rear end treatments, but whether it's your 59 Impala lurking in the background there, or these cars, they certainly have a distinctive signature from the rear.
Very much. So here's also a typical treatment. This is the Bonneville, the top of the line. So the emphasis here was clearly on width. If they could have, they probably would have gone with a full-width tail lamp cluster here on the Bonneville with all the chambers and the lamps illuminated. They chose not to do this. Usually it's a cost-driven thing because electrical and engineering say we don't want that much wiring, not so many bulbs. Design usually wants that. So in this case, we have a very unified horizontal theme, typical motif for the time, making them look wide, right? Everything that is already enormously wide looks even wider when you make it a horizontally themed.
And the Grand Prix took that to the extreme.
Grand Prix took it to the extreme with these the ribbed panels that it had.
I always thought that looked fantastic.
It looked very, that was the whole thing. It was mysterious. It was a little stealth, and it had that clean look. So it was something that was supposed to draw attention to itself for its character. And there's a hint of that here with the ribbed insert panel between the tail lamps. But it's ironic that these enormously wide cars that really don't need any further horizontal clues to make them look wider, they accentuated those to make them even more wide-looking, which in today's SUV world is positively shocking when you see the change of proportion when these cars go down the road.
I wonder, I'm looking at this car on the side, and I'm wondering if Mercury copied for 68 a bit or 67 the taillight plus
you could
rise
think that
in the door.
The Cougar too has very similar approaches, a sculptural flare at the bottom. This is a very interesting thing. When we talked about our Oldsmobiles a few weeks ago, and we mentioned the Skeg line, which is this very strong, distinctive lower body side feature, we have a version of that here. And the beautiful thing about these mid-60s Pontiacs is they are symmetrical in the sense that the body side line flow at the belt line is mirrored at the lower body side, which makes them even more Coke bottle shaped and refers to the classic Coke bottle tipped on its side. And there is something very, very beautiful in the way the reflections run over all these complex in and out shapes. I always refer to this period, the early to late 60s, actually late 50s to late 60s when I look at my 59 Chevy, as the era where the cars threw shadows on themselves, because they had such deep draw, complex shapes on the body sides. And that's certainly the case here. Very much accentuated with that lower brightwork cladding, the lower panels that are following that line and making the body side look even leaner and even longer.
It's interesting. It's handsome. Now Ford kind of did it, but here there's a bit of a shoulder, but Ford always had that pronounced shoulder on the door. As well, a little bit different style that they kept. GM had more cleaner side sections, I think, even into the 70s.
Yeah, I mean, Ford had its own interpretation of this style. If you look at the 1964 Thunderbird, which has an interesting body side sculpture, you find elements of that on the Cougars and on some of the early 70s Ford cars, where you have a very sculptural body side theme with little changes in direction of the lines. They have little kick-ups and little undercuts and little scallops in there. The T-Bird has that, but in a much more angular way, so you don't read the sort of central shapes. These cars here were very central. They're very sexy. They had very natural, very, very organic looking shapes that were all very well controlled with the crisp trim lines and the very controlled and disciplined detailing they had. So you had this very elegant flow of the reflections and the play of light over the surfaces that made them look very much alive. And you had the impression that this was a technical product by all the metal details that were added to them to accentuate the shapes, but they gave them some look of precision and definition.
And it's amazing because this is a top-of-the-line car, but it's quite devoid of chrome, aside from some very...
Well, I wouldn't call it devoid of chrome if the entire lower cladding is stainless.
Okay, fair enough.
But it is, because it's so big and because it has so much surface area to work with, and it's all done with the shape. I mean, this car could do without the bright work accents to convey the theme. It's mostly done with the shape. It's very clean, but I wouldn't call this devoid of chrome. What's very nice about these cars is that the attention to detail extends into little things like picking up the body side section in the bumper shapes. You see here how it terminates and blends into this very clean profile line. And you have the W plan view shapes, which was a very popular motif for GM.
That continued for some,
that was very popular into the early 70s.
The second gen Riviera too.
Right, to an extreme even, where this helps give some visual interest and some liveliness to an otherwise very austere and severe theme, and you have these broad horizontal lines. It can look very architectural and almost lifeless if you don't have something in it that gives it a little bit of definition and some visual play and interest. So as soon as the reflections sort of hop around here, you've got that little crease in the middle that terminates in the V-shaped Pontiac logo, and you have these beautiful angles and surrounding bezels around the tail lamps. All of that is visual interest that makes the shapes that are fundamentally quite beautiful even more intriguing to look at.
And it's similar but different back here on the Catalina. They have...
Yeah, this is a less expensive execution. You have more emphasis on the individual tail lamp bezels, so you have two group pods left and right, and of course you don't have quite as much money riding between the lamps because it's just a Catalina. And so it's just a painted panel instead of that expensive bright work that you see on the Bonneville.
Yeah, I just love the roof line kind of set inboard from the fender line. And
there is so much depth, which is a fascinating aspect of these cars. When you look at the outer edge, extreme edge of the body, and then where the actual backlight outer edge is, you have about 1.5 feet. This is probably 15, 16 inches, if not more, from the most extreme to about this portion. And while these cars certainly were somewhat excessive in their size, they're so beautifully sculpted and they're so sensual. They're really sexy looking cars that you forgive them the bulk in a way, because they're, in spite of the bulk, they're quite lean, and the flowing lines make them look just so beautiful. It's hard to take your eyes off of them.
Well, very good. Let's maybe take a quick break and we can talk about the interior a little bit. Perhaps.
Sure.
All right, let's talk a little bit about the interior. Mark knows quite a bit about interior design as well as the exterior.
Lately, because it's been mainly where I've been playing, the sandbox I've been playing in for the last 10 years or so. But of course I also did exteriors for a long, long time because I'm really old. Been doing this for 30 years. But yeah, this is an interesting interior because it has a fascinating balance of simplicity and complexity. Simplicity because the basic shape of the instrument panel, the basic shapes on the interior, it's a bench seat, it's got very simple door cards or door trim panels, it's got stock General Motors hardware that was reused on many other models at the time. But then it has some interesting complexity in the way the gauges are arranged, and the gauges have a driver orientation, which is also noteworthy. That was not commonly done in those days, and later in the 70s, companies like BMW took a lot of credit for pioneering driver-oriented cockpits, but that's nonsense because versions of that have been around in several car companies, and Pontiac was one of the pioneers. The Grand Prix of the late 60s, early 70s had very driver-oriented cockpits.
The 66 Tornado with that whole...
Yes, it did. It was graphically driver-oriented, isolating the driver with the color breakup, but it wasn't driver-oriented in the sense that the instruments or the controls were curved around the driver. When we speak of driver orientation, in the design world, we mean that the driver position or the driver placement is specifically catered to by the shapes on the interior, meaning that the controls all curve towards the driver and the instruments are all angled towards the driver. And examples are this placement of the gauges here, the instruments to the right of the speedometer. On a flat fascia, there's not much, there's no driver orientation in the basic shape of the instrument panel, but the gauges do that, which is an interesting execution. And then later on in the Grand Prix and even some of the Mopars of the Cudas and some of the Chrysler products, they had a driver-oriented cockpit where you have a cluster that wraps around the driver area.
A little bit the 71 to 3 GM full size.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely, the ones with the modular or the serviceable instrument panel segments were very much driver oriented.
All
the Buick
except the Chevy.
All except the Chevy were driver oriented with a half round, like a sweeping, almost half round arrangement of these individual pods around the driver. So there's many interpretations long before companies like BMW and others picked that up in the later 1970s. But of course, these cars weren't necessarily made for engaging, curvy mountain road driving, so it didn't have.
And the Bonneville's got the ride and handling package, so that's...
I'm sure that's nice at the shopping mall, but I'm not sure if that makes any sense in any other roads. But we laugh about this, but these cars handle surprisingly well for their bulk.
They do.
And they have a bad reputation, but most people don't know what they're talking about, because these cars are actually a lot more drivable and roadable than they're being given credit for.
They are. I mean, we have quite a few roundabouts in the area, and I surprise people, and I
yeah,
run them around the outer ring of the roundabout.
I think what is mostly in the way of enjoying a more engaging driving style, so to speak, other than the bulk, is that most of the time you have very flat seats. Like you have a bench seat here, there's no lateral support in the seats.
Yeah, the seat is the limiting factor.
Is the limiting, exactly.
Not
the seating is the limiting factor. And well, the suspension I'm sure has limits too, but they were much better than their reputation in the context of their times. You have to modify that classic cars are all relatively garbage compared to today's cars when it comes to handling. But for most of the everyday driving we do, even at the speeds that the army, the armada of SUVs is moving today, these are totally capable of holding their own.
And this one has no wood trim, but it does have a nice detail. That's the Catalina detail there on the
Well, that's a nice cliche that was often deployed because it gives you a three-dimensional depth. It's a clear panel that floats over. Basically, you can see a little bit of depth. You perceive a little bit of richness there.
Yeah, you do.
And it's not really done with much effort and with much investment, but it gives you a lovely three-dimensional effect because you can see through the clear material, and that adds a little bit of intrigue and visual interest and gives you something to look at that says, okay, my money went somewhere.
And to Mark's point, these are all rotated toward the driver. You can see it a little bit better.
And that works quite nice. I think they're actually, from a readability point of view, are quite good. Even though they have bright work around them, they don't reflect too much. You can actually see the instruments quite well.
No, you have enough of an overhang.
You have enough of a shaded pad on top that allows you to read the instruments well, which was a bit of a problem in those days with many cars that had a lot of bright work and bling dazzling you on a bright day.
So let's take a look at the 65, because this has the square pods. In 65 they were round.
Yes. Another way to differentiate years. So Pontiac did that. They vacillated between round and square just for the heck of it. And here we see basically the same instrument panel. Once again, the expensive tooling, the metal stamping tooling, the tools that you strike the instrument panel metal with, they're the same as on the Catalina. And here we have real wood trim, which is a unique thing to Pontiac.
It was.
Cadillac also did some real wood trim, but for the most part, American car companies by the mid-60s, if they were using wood trim at all, which was rare then, it was already fake. And Pontiac stuck with the real stuff for quite some time. My 64 Grand Prix also had real wood veneer. We see some of that very beautiful here you lost one in the steering
wheel. I have
to
glue that back on.
Yeah, you still have the original one, but it is real wood veneer. It looks like walnut to me. What is this? Is this walnut?
I think it is walnut.
I think it's walnut.
Yeah.
And it's just a low gloss, so it's very trendy. It's kind of open pore, low gloss wood.
It is trendy, like they're doing now with the open pore.
It's very much apropos, but right now, everything that's going on right now harkens back to the mid-century.
That's interesting.
The 1960s, so.
More elaborate door card here.
Yes, you have carpeting at the bottom. It's an upscale version, so you have a more dignified and richer look with the vertical pleating, but it's essentially the same instrument panel with some different detailing inserted, like the round bezels for the instruments and the wood veneer, but it's otherwise the same instrument panel.
I thought it was a cool theme they had for the AC cars, where they integrated the vent into this top pad too.
The AC cars usually had 2 or 3 vents on the IP. This one has, I think it has 3, right?
3, yes. There's one on either side.
That was pretty typical of the time. Usually they were all under the instrument panel or done in such a pod. If you look closely, you have, this is an add-on piece. This is actually, the corner piece can be removed in the non-AC cars. It doesn't have that circular vent, so it's just a different, this is actually a casting. This is not even a stamping. And the ones on the dash pad, this is a molded part, so there was a different tool for the top pad, for the instrument panel pad molding, to receive the center vent there. And then on the passenger side, you have what we later called crotch coolers, which is basically blowing at your most intimate area when you're sitting in the
There's
car.
one there,
oh,
too.
actually, we have 4. Yeah,
Yeah.
I didn't even see that one. The steering column was in the way. So we have actually 4, which is unusual. This is more than you would normally get. Normally you'd get 2, maybe 3 in the 60s, and it wasn't until the later 60s, early 70s that the outlets, the vent outlets, became pretty much standard. Because in those days you had these babies here, right?
The vent window.
The vent windows, and
Yeah.
they're very effective. And towards the late 60s, you start seeing them go away as air conditioning became more ubiquitous, and the vent window was no longer needed. So by the late 60s, that became a little visual cue that you were a high roller. You spent the money on air conditioning because those cars often deleted that quarter window.
This car does have the first year for automatic climate control that was non-Cadillac. Cadillac had it exclusive in 64.
Yes, in 64, the automatic climate control with a very complex system. The Comfortron.
This is the sensor for it. Some
Correct,
people ask
yes.
what that is, but
Yeah.
this does have automatic climate control. So you rotate this for the temperature, and it changes the fan speed and where the air comes out.
And of course, designing it exactly to look like
Another radio.
Like the radio is a perfect setup for inadvertent actuation of the wrong thing. So you want to change a station, and now
And
you're
there's
getting
a
a
lighter
blaster.
in the middle.
And there's a lighter in the middle. So you're going to set the car on fire while you're trying to change the station, but you're getting a blast of cold air in your face.
That's good design, right?
Well, I mean, they didn't have smartphones in those days, so they had no other distractions. So you needed to have something else.
Well, very good. And this has both of these cars actually have, I thought it was funny, they had an optional custom foam front cushion only, where you could pay extra money.
I noticed that when I
for
first got
deeper
in the
fall.
car, because it doesn't have it in the back, and
No.
the rear seat is significantly less comfortable than the front seat to sit on.
And it says on the option sticker that it's only for the front. It says custom foam front cushion.
Foam rubber was a relatively new thing in the 1950s. Foam rubber really came in the 1950s. My 59 Chevy Impala has foam rubber cushions for the seat. That was a selling point. That was a hallmark of the Impala series. The other ones did not have that. And I'm surprised that by the mid-60s, Pontiac still made that optional, but as we learned from your car, they did.
They did, indeed. Well, very good, Mark. Thanks so much for the interior and exterior design detail of two of, I would say, mid-60s GM's finest.
They're gems. They're really, really beautiful cars. They stand out today. They even stood out back then in the sense that this was a significant enough design trend that was copied by almost everybody. Actually, it was copied by everybody. It was certainly copied by Ford and by Chrysler a little later. And it went global. There was a whole slew of hippie cars, meaning the shapes, not the social movement. And as soon as everybody adopted it globally, GM had dropped it, so by the time the early 70s rolled around, it actually looked kind of outdated. Chrysler Europe adopted that for their bigger cars, the Chrysler 180 and 2-liter cars. They looked like a shrunk-down version of the 1969 fuselage cars with a little bit of a hip line to it, and they looked very, very much out of date by 1972 or 73. So this was a fashion trend, and like all fashion trend, it comes, trends, it comes and goes.
Well, very good. Thanks so much, Mark, for your design commentary and coming back to Rare Classic Cars.
We're going for a little spin in the 65. I haven't driven it yet, so thanks for giving me an opportunity to drive it. I absolutely love, we forgot to, you've mentioned this before, the clear resin steering wheel rim, the partial clear resin steering wheel rim. It looks amazing in this light as the sunlight comes in and refracts and gives you this jeweled look, and it doesn't even look half as tacky as I thought it would. It looks actually quite convincing, like a mysterious sort of, because it's still in excellent shape, it's not cracked. I'm just gonna do a little spin around the cul-de-sac here to just see the light play. Oh, now the sun goes away, but I just wanted to see how the light plays through the rim as you turn the wheel. It's just an amazing effect. Just an amazing effect. It's really, it looks great. I love that.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah. It's a very, very classically handsome instrument panel. It looks quite upscale. Are we turning here? Or
No, you go straight.
That's right. Getting lost in McMansionville here. But this is another neat feature that Pontiac was promoting for many years. The grab, the grab handle. You know, where are we going?
Right.
Right. I lost my way here before. Yeah, this grab handle, that was a very, very popular Pontiac accessory. Not on all cars, but on the up-level ones, in the Grand Prix and such. It was in the Bonnevilles, it was very common.
Right.
And the detailing on this instrument panel is also quite beautiful. There's no plastique here at all, except little things like the bezel for the temperature sensor and a couple of very small things. So we're seeing the beginning of plastique on the interiors, but everything else is properly solid material, real metal, real wood, bright chrome, painted metal. The column is all painted, cast or stamped. It's just amazing. It's the quality. Love it. The garnish is anodized aluminum. All the moldings on the garnish are anodized aluminum, polished.
Well, thanks for watching. If you want to see Mark back on this channel, drop a comment in the comment section and let me know what you think of this particular video. Thanks again.